Hello, my name is Dr. Volker Prott. I'm a lecturer in modern history at Aston University in Birmingham. And in this video, I'm going to talk about what I think are some of the blind spots in the study of internationalism. Now, I think it's important to think about or reflect on these blind spots because that will help us better understand periods of decline in internationalism and in international cooperation, as for instance we're witnessing right now in the early 21st century. Now, I think one of the main blind spots in the study of internationalism is the tendency to focus on the benign, the positive aspects of internationalism. Now, this was a view that was particularly prevalent in the 1990s or the early 2000s when scholars were quite enthusiastic about transnationalism, about transnational activism, but I think it's a view that has in some form or another continued until this day. And I think it has three main problems. The first is that it underestimates the international activism of particular groups, for instance radical nationalists, terrorists, fascists. The second problem is that this overly optimistic view of internationalism ignores or downplays selfish interests of transnational activists as though they were only acting in the service of the greater good of international peace. The third problem is that this optimistic view of internationalism presents international cooperation or internationalism as the only viable alternative for the course of history. It seems as if this were some sort of master narrative where history progresses to a state of peaceful internationalism. Now, I think that these shortcomings of or in the study of internationalism have made it harder for us to understand periods in decline of international cooperation, made it harder for us to understand contradictions and gaps and cracks in the international system, in international cooperation. Now, just to give you an example from my own research, where I'm looking at foreign interventions in the Cold War, in the Congo Crisis in the 60s, and in the Indo-Pakistani conflict in the late 40s, and again in 1971. Now, here I'm very interested in what I call the interveners, so UN blue helmets, missionaries, humanitarian activists, but also mercenaries, spies, and so on. And what I find is that in most, if not all of these interveners, they are driven by personal motivations, by motivations of ideology that very rarely align with the interests of the local population, that are very rarely in line with the interests of the broader international community. Now, just to give you two more specific brief examples of this. In the conflict in East Pakistan in 1971, what I've come across is what I call rogue humanitarian activists from Europe crossing the border from India into East Pakistan in order to raise publicity for their own organization, and also, of course, raising publicity about the crisis that was going on in East Pakistan at this time. And they were completely and fully conscious of the fact that their actions may indeed harden the attitude of the Pakistani government and undermine efforts by the United Nations and the international community really to find a peaceful solution to that conflict. At the other end of the spectrum, in the Congo Crisis, there were many white mercenaries going into the Congo and fighting for one of the different factions. And what I found is that, at least in many press interviews, these people say that they were going there to defend liberal democracy and fight for Western civilization and fight what they saw as neo-colonialism of the United Nations. Now, this shows us that reality is really messy and complex, and I would therefore urge us as scholars of internationalism to ask more critical questions. To ask, for instance, who benefits from globalization, from a globalized world, who manages internationalism, who controls it. We should examine more closely the local impact of transnational activism. And we should look more closely and focus more closely on the gaps and the contradictions and the cracks in international relations and in international cooperation, transnationalism. And that, as I said, will help us understand the current decline of international cooperation, I think, in a better way, and also help us think about alternative forms of internationalism. Thank you very much.